The truck rumbled down the dusty road, its wheels creaking under the weight of the prisoners it carried. 3 German women, pale and thin from months of war, sat in the back, their eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. It was late September 1945, and the world felt like it was still recovering from the chaos of the war. The cold air outside didn't match the fear and uncertainty that wrapped tightly around their hearts. They had seen too much to believe that any form of kindness could exist now, and the American soldiers who had captured them were no different from the rest. All they could do was brace for the worst. Irene, the eldest of the 3, sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her once sharp eyes had dulled with exhaustion, and her mind replayed the horrors of the past years. She had lived through bombings, hunger, and the brutality of being displaced. But the real torment was not knowing what would come next. She whispered to the other 2 women, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance, though even she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. "Expect nothing," she muttered. "They will break us slowly. That's what they do." Next to her, Gretel, who was barely 20, clutched a family photo to her chest, as though the paper could somehow shield her from the fate she feared was waiting. Her fingers trembled, but she kept the photo hidden in the folds of her tattered coat. She didn't trust anyone anymore, especially not the Americans. It was easier to believe that their kindness was just a trick to get them to relax, to lower their guard. If they could trick them into thinking there was hope, it would be all the easier to break them down when the time came. Anna, the youngest of the 3, said nothing. At 23, she had already been through too much to expect anything better from the world. She had seen soldiers come and go, been marched across countries, lived through the chaos of battlefields, and watched as people she had once called family disappeared in the smoke of war. She had learned not to expect kindness, not to hope for any better than what she had already endured. The best she could do was survive. And right now, survival meant staying quiet and keeping her fears hidden behind a mask of indifference. As the truck finally slowed to a halt, a sense of dread washed over them all. The doors creaked open and harsh sunlight poured in. The women squinted against the brightness, blinking as their eyes tried to adjust. Outside, they could see the outlines of what looked like a military compound. It was nothing like the filthy, overcrowded camps they had been in before. The buildings were neat and orderly, almost sterile. The ground was clear of rubble, the roads smooth, and the guards standing at attention seemed almost too professional. Something about this place didn't feel right, almost too perfect. "Where are the smokestacks?" Irene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had heard rumors of American camps where prisoners were put to work, but this didn't match what she had expected. There were no signs of the usual suffering, no gruel-filled kitchens, no guards barking orders. The air didn't carry the scent of sweat and fear, but instead smelled of fresh paint and clean linen. Irene couldn't quite place it, but it made her feel even more uneasy. It was as if they were being set up for something far worse. The women were herded off the truck, their feet hitting the ground with a dull thud. The American soldiers, who had been standing nearby, now moved toward them. There were no shouts, no harsh commands, just a quiet, almost respectful demeanor. For a moment, the women were confused. They had braced themselves for the usual treatment, insults, rough handling, and the constant fear of what would come next. But here, there was nothing. The soldiers merely watched them, and one of them, a young man, stepped forward. "You are under the protection of the United States Army," he said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of formality. His words were calm, almost rehearsed, and yet they seemed to hang in the air with an unfamiliar weight. It was as though they had entered a world where such phrases actually meant something. The words didn't sink in at first. The prisoners stared at him, unsure of how to react. Just as Irene was about to speak, another officer, a woman in a crisp uniform, stepped forward. Her name tag read Captain Mitchell. She said something to the man who had spoken earlier and then turned back to the prisoners with a smile. Her expression was calm, even kind, but there was something about it that felt almost calculated. As the woman spoke, an interpreter stepped forward, translating her words into German. "You will be processed and given medical care," the translator said. "You will receive clothing, food, and bedding." Irene's eyes narrowed. This was far from what they had been told to expect. Medical care? Food? Bedding? It seemed too good to be true. This wasn't what the women had been prepared for. All they had ever known in captivity was deprivation, cruelty, and the constant threat of death. Yet here they were offered care, as though they were not prisoners at all, but ordinary civilians seeking help. But the idea of being treated with dignity was so foreign to them that they could hardly believe it. As they were ushered toward a building that looked more like a hotel than a prison, Gretel, the youngest, stopped in her tracks. She stared at the clean white towels stacked neatly in the hallway, the scent of soap and fresh linen filling the air. It was too much to process. She had lived for months without anything resembling cleanliness, and now here they were, being treated like they were people of value. She felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if this was some kind of dream. But then Irene's voice broke through her thoughts. "Don't trust them," she whispered, though her own heart was beginning to waver. "We can't afford to believe that this is real. Don't let your guard down." But even she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to herself or trying to convince the others that they should continue to expect the worst. They were shown to their quarters, small rooms with simple cots, fresh sheets, and more towels than they had seen in years. For the first time since their capture, the women began to feel something that they had long since given up on: hope. But in the back of their minds, a tiny voice whispered that this hope might be a trap, and that the kindness being shown to them was not an act of goodwill, but a way to prepare them for something far worse. For now, they could do nothing but wait. And in that waiting, they would have to decide whether this strange new world was a chance for survival or just another cruel trick of war. The following days in Camp Blackwater were a blur of confusion, disbelief, and reluctant adaptation. Each morning began with the clang of the bell signaling that it was time for the women to wake up. The sound was strangely comforting, like the call of a clock that governed their world now. But it was the simplicity of the daily routine that caught them off guard. They were given time to shower, real showers, with hot water streaming from the pipes and thick soap to wash away the grime of war. They hadn't had this luxury in years. Even the simplest of comforts, like a warm towel after a bath, felt like a foreign indulgence. Irene, who had led her fellow prisoners through countless hardships, found herself at a loss for how to respond to this unexpected generosity. She had seen the best and the worst of humanity, but she wasn't prepared for this strange kindness. The thought that these people might be treating them with respect, as if they were human, weighed heavily on her. There was no history of such treatment in her mind, no precedence for the clean sheets and steady meals. It all felt so surreal that it was hard to trust. As the women adjusted to the camp's strange new routine, the guards, mostly young men and women, became familiar faces. They didn't shout orders or treat the women like cattle. They spoke to them politely and even smiled at times, offering small gestures of kindness. One young guard, a boy named Thomas, would bring them books to read in the evenings. They were basic English primers, simple and childish, but the women pounced on them like a gift. To think that just months ago they had been surviving on scraps, fighting for their lives in brutal conditions. Now they had access to books, to learning, to real food. It didn't make sense. The women were given tasks to do. Some were assigned to the kitchen, others to cleaning the barracks, and a few worked in the gardens. It felt like a different world. As Gretel worked alongside the others, carefully picking vegetables in the morning light, she couldn't help but feel like this was all a lie. They were treated like laborers, not prisoners, and that was almost more frightening than if they had been kept locked in a cage. What did they want from them? Why were they giving them this strange semblance of normalcy? Anna, the quietest of the group, had begun to retreat inward. She spent most of her time walking the camp's neat, well-kept paths, her eyes darting around at the serene surroundings. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sun casting soft light over the barracks, and yet her mind was a battlefield. She didn't understand how this place worked. She couldn't reconcile the treatment they were receiving with what she had heard about America. There was no cruelty here, no outward signs of the hatred she had expected. It was as if the world had turned upside down and the rules of war had been rewritten. Even the food was different. Each meal was a reminder of how far they had fallen from their previous lives. There were hot meals, meat, bread, vegetables, things they hadn't had in months. And they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, without the constant worry of rationing. But even this felt off to Irene. She couldn't help but wonder if this was just another form of control. If they were fed and bathed, perhaps it would be easier for the Americans to extract information from them. Perhaps the comfort would make them complacent, less suspicious, and more willing to speak. But each day, as the women grew more accustomed to their new environment, they began to realize something they hadn't expected. A strange camaraderie was developing. Despite the reservations, they were beginning to see each other as more than just fellow prisoners. They were survivors, bound together not just by their past, but by the fact that they were being treated like people. This bond, this human connection, was something they had not experienced in years. It was foreign, strange, and perhaps the most dangerous part of all. As the days passed, the question of trust became more complicated. Irene had to confront the fact that she was starting to trust the Americans, even as she feared them. She had heard the stories about the cruelty of American soldiers. She had seen firsthand the brutality of war. But here, in this strange place, it didn't feel like war. The reality was too confusing for her to process. Was this kindness truly genuine, or was it part of a calculated strategy to break them down emotionally? She didn't know. Gretel, too, found herself torn between hope and suspicion. The other women seemed to be falling into this new rhythm with ease, accepting the generosity of the Americans, but Gretel couldn't bring herself to do the same. She still clutched the family photo she had hidden, and in quiet moments she would pull it out, running her fingers over the faces of her loved ones. They were the only things that kept her grounded, the only reminder that the world she knew still existed somewhere, even if it felt miles away. Anna, on the other hand, remained resolutely silent. She didn't trust the Americans, but she didn't trust the Germans either. Her past had made her wary of all sides. She couldn't allow herself to believe in the goodness of this place, no matter how kind the soldiers were, no matter how soft the towels felt after each bath. She had seen too many lies, too many promises broken, to let her guard down now. Yet, despite all their fears and doubts, something began to shift in the air. It was subtle at first, a quiet change in how they interacted with one another, a softness that hadn't been there before. The kindness, the comfort, wasn't as terrifying as it had once been. They were still prisoners, but they weren't treated like animals anymore. And in a world that had long since stripped away any notion of mercy, this new experience, no matter how it was wrapped, felt like a step towards something they hadn't dared to hope for. But was it real? That question loomed over every woman in the camp. Could they truly trust what they were being given, or was this just another way to break them? No one had an answer, and maybe they never would. But for now, they would wait. And in the waiting, they would have to decide whether to accept this strange new world or reject it entirely. The choice was theirs to make, but the consequences of that choice were still unknown. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life in Camp Blackwater began to set in. At first, the women had been so overwhelmed by the sudden shift in their environment that they barely knew how to react. They were still prisoners, still bound by the rules of war, but the daily schedule, the regular meals, and the attention to cleanliness had thrown them into a state of disorientation. They were slowly adjusting, and with each passing day, the strange comfort of their new routine felt both surreal and unsettling. Irene, despite her reservations, found herself growing accustomed to the structure. She had spent years surviving through chaos, always alert, always ready for the next blow. But now she was being given something that she hadn't expected: predictability. Each day started with the bell that signaled the morning, followed by breakfast, which was always hot and filling. In between their assigned tasks, cleaning, working in the garden, and learning English, they were given time to themselves. They could read, write, or simply rest. It wasn't the way she had imagined captivity, and it left her with an unsettling sense of guilt. The guilt stemmed from something deeper than just being treated with kindness. Irene couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a trick. The Americans had to be manipulating them in some way. She had learned to distrust every act of kindness, every piece of bread handed to them, every soft word spoken by the soldiers. It was too much like the calm before a storm. And yet, a part of her, a part that had been buried for so long under the weight of survival, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real, that the kindness they were being shown wasn't just a setup for something far worse. Gretel, on the other hand, embraced the routine with more enthusiasm, though she too felt the sting of suspicion gnawing at her. She began to form tentative connections with the other women, finding solace in their shared experiences. When she worked in the garden, her hands, once shaking with fear, now found a strange comfort in the soil. The simple act of pulling weeds or picking vegetables felt normal. For the first time in years, Gretel felt like she was participating in something that wasn't survival or fighting or evasion. It was just life. Quiet, unremarkable, and, for a fleeting moment, peaceful. But despite her growing ease with the new routine, Gretel still felt the heavy presence of fear lurking just beneath the surface. She wasn't sure whether it was the routine itself that was the trap, or her own lingering distrust that prevented her from fully giving in. She had learned too much during the war to allow herself to get comfortable, and every night she would pull the small photograph of her family from her coat pocket. The faces of her parents and siblings, frozen in happier times, were the only things that kept her grounded in reality. She couldn't allow herself to forget what she had lost, what she still might lose. Anna, ever the quiet one, struggled with the same inner conflict, but in a different way. She had spent so much time in captivity, so many years adjusting to different environments, that the sudden shift in the camp's treatment of her felt like an intrusion into her carefully built walls. She didn't trust the kindness she was receiving, and every time someone spoke to her with a smile or offered her help, she couldn't help but feel like she was being studied. The Americans, they were trying to soften them, to make them believe that they were safe, but Anna had learned that safety was always an illusion. She didn't know how to live without suspicion, without waiting for the inevitable betrayal. The women around her were beginning to feel like comrades, but she still saw them as potential threats to her fragile sense of self-preservation. Despite her doubts, Anna found herself beginning to look forward to the small moments of quiet. The time spent sitting in the sun, reading the simple English books the soldiers brought them, was like a balm to her weary soul. It was a strange luxury she hadn't known in so long. She still kept to herself more than the others, but she couldn't deny that the daily routine, the food, the warmth, was doing something to her. It was breaking down the walls she had built, and for the first time in years, she found herself missing things she had long ago forgotten. Simple things, like her mother's cooking, or the warmth of home, or the sound of children playing outside. But with each small step toward adaptation, each act of trust she allowed herself to feel, Anna's fears intensified. She was walking a dangerous line, allowing herself to believe that maybe the Americans were not like all the others. She feared what would happen if they realized this moment of peace was not normal, that they couldn't let their guard down, even in the face of such generosity. The question that haunted her was the same one that haunted Irene and Gretel. What did the Americans want from them? Why this sudden shift in behavior? In the mornings, when they gathered for their daily tasks, Irene couldn't help but notice how their relationships with the guards were changing. The young soldiers, who had been stern and distant in the beginning, were now more relaxed around them. Some even laughed and joked with the women, making small talk about the weather or the work they had to do. Irene was unsure how to respond to this newfound ease. It wasn't natural, not for prisoners. The more she observed, the more she wondered if this change in behavior was a subtle form of manipulation. Were they trying to break their spirits by offering comfort only to take it away later? Or was this just the way it was in America? The work they did was simple. Some women worked in the gardens, others cleaned the barracks, and a few even helped in the kitchen. There was a sense of purpose in the tasks, but it was tinged with uncertainty. What would happen when they had fulfilled their usefulness? Would the kindness stop, or would it evolve into something more controlling? As each day passed, the women began to feel as though they were becoming part of the machinery of the camp, a piece of it, but not fully in control of their own fates. Gretel, though fearful, couldn't deny the feeling of being useful. She had forgotten what it was like to be needed, to contribute to something other than survival. In the kitchen, she had been taught how to cook simple meals for the other prisoners, and her hands, which had once trembled at the thought of preparing food, now moved with purpose. There was something almost soothing in the repetition, in knowing that the work she did would feed others. Yet, even as she embraced this small role, she still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that everything she did here was being watched, measured, and controlled. In the evenings, as the women sat together in the common area, the reality of their situation hit them once again. They were not free. They had not escaped the war. They were still prisoners. The small comforts, the soft towels, the regular meals, none of that could change the fact that they were at the mercy of their captors. The question remained, were they simply being lulled into a false sense of security, or was this truly a new beginning for them, a chance at a life that was not defined by violence and fear? Only time would tell, but for now, all they could do was keep moving forward, one day at a time. As the days in Camp Blackwater stretched on, the women began to feel more accustomed to their new routines, but something in the air shifted. The camp, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a carefully crafted illusion, fragile and temporary. The daily activities that had once brought a sense of comfort began to feel like a performance, as if everyone was playing a part in a show they could never fully understand. The Americans, who had treated them with such unexpected kindness, were beginning to seem less like saviors and more like actors in a grand, unsettling play. Irene, who had been the most skeptical from the start, began to feel a growing sense of discomfort. The small moments of generosity, the soft cowls, the warm food, the opportunity to bathe regularly, were no longer enough to mask the unease gnawing at her. She found herself staring at the guards more often, studying their faces and wondering what they were really thinking. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched constantly, that their every move was being noted and analyzed. The kindness they were receiving felt less like genuine care and more like a strategy to make them compliant. The changes in the camp had become more noticeable as well. At first, the American soldiers had treated the women with a detached professionalism, but now there was something different in the way they interacted. Some guards were more relaxed, even friendly, while others seemed more distant and cold. Irene could sense the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was as if the camp was on the verge of something that would change everything. The guards' behavior was not the only thing that unsettled Irene. She began to notice that the supplies they had grown accustomed to, the clean sheets, the soap, the hot water, were becoming scarcer. The once regular deliveries of food and medicine were slowing down. The women still received meals, but the portions seemed smaller, less generous. The water that had once flowed freely from the taps now came with more restrictions. The showers, which had been a symbol of their new life, were now being rationed. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was enough to make Irene's heart race with suspicion. Gretel, for her part, was still clinging to the small piece of hope she had found in the camp. She had formed tentative bonds with the other women, and the friendships she was starting to build gave her a sense of purpose. But even she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts happening around them. One evening, as she worked in the garden with a few other women, she overheard a conversation between two American soldiers. They were discussing something in low voices, but the words security breach and protocols caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat. What did that mean for them? Were they in danger again? The next morning, the camp's atmosphere had noticeably shifted. The soldiers were on edge, their easy smiles replaced with terse commands. There were whispers among the women, but no one knew what was happening. The guards were more vigilant than ever, their eyes scanning the women as they moved about their duties. The sense of comfort that had settled over them in the last few weeks evaporated, replaced by a quiet, looming dread. It was as though a shadow had fallen over the camp, and no one knew when or where it would strike. Anna, who had remained mostly silent throughout their time in the camp, began to sense the change too. She had always kept to herself, but now she noticed the subtle shifts in the way the other women interacted with the soldiers. There was a discomfort in the air, a fear that hadn't been there before. Anna was the first to pull away, her intuition warning her that something was about to go terribly wrong. She had seen it before, the calm before the storm, and now she could feel it again, even if she couldn't explain why. In the evenings, as they sat together in the common area, Irene couldn't help but feel that they were being lulled into a false sense of security. They had started to believe, even if only for a moment, that they could trust the Americans, that they weren't like the other captors they had encountered during the war. But as the days wore on and the small comforts began to fade, Irene couldn't help but question everything. Had it all been an illusion? A way to make them complacent before the real test came? The breaking point came one evening, when a group of American soldiers arrived at the camp, their uniforms crisp and their expressions stern. They were not the usual guards. These men carried an air of authority that unsettled the women. The soldiers moved through the camp, speaking with the officers in low voices, their presence making everyone uneasy. It wasn't just the fact that they were new faces, it was the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from them. The camp, which had been so quiet and orderly, now felt tense and charged with anticipation. Irene stood by the window of their barracks, watching as the soldiers gathered near the administration building. The usual sense of safety, the quiet comfort of their routines, had been replaced by something darker. She couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she watched them. Something was changing, and it felt like the walls were closing in around them. They were still prisoners, after all, and the kindness they had been shown could be taken away at any moment. Gretel, who had been trying to remain hopeful, now found herself doubting everything she had believed. The change in the camp was subtle, but undeniable. She had started to feel that the Americans' kindness was not just an act of mercy, but a calculated move to make them more compliant. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a larger plan, one that they weren't privy to. The promise of safety, of dignity, was starting to feel like a trap. Anna, who had withdrawn even further into herself, found that her fears had been confirmed. The camp was no longer a place of refuge, but a place of control. She had learned to survive in the harshest conditions, but now she wasn't sure how to survive in this new reality. They were being kept in line, given just enough comfort to make them feel human again, but not enough to truly free them. The walls of their confinement had changed, but they were still confined. The realization settled heavily in her chest. As the days passed, the tension continued to rise. The small cracks in the camp's facade grew wider, and the women began to see the truth behind the kindness they had been shown. It wasn't real, not in the way they had hoped. It was just another layer of control, another form of manipulation. They were still prisoners, still at the mercy of their captors.